An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. This morning I'm going to continue talking about Gassho and about the dignified behavior of a Buddha. And I'll talk a little more about this later, but I just want to show you this picture that I found on Google of Thich Nhat Hanh doing Gassho. He doesn't do Gassho exactly the way we do it. Our hands would be higher, but it's very difficult to see this picture, see his eyes. But this is an amazing photograph, and you can find it on Google Images. Okay, so the first lecture that I gave on this, we talked about the meaning of Gassho as the dignified behavior of a Buddha. And I'm going to repeat the introduction to this lecture to put it in the context. And if you want to listen to or watch this lecture, the first one, Rihanna has kindly posted it on YouTube, and the name of it is Gassho, and it's also, the audio version is on the website. So, as I mentioned the first time, Dogen wrote a lot about what we call forms, the way that we do things in the Zendo or in the monastery, or as Soto Zen practitioners. So he talked a lot about this, and it's a whole lot of activities. It's a kind of body yoga that we use in Soto Zen. Because the essays that he wrote are pretty prescriptive, I would say that for the most part, we don't read those essays in the Shobogenzo, but there are several of them. But one essay that he did write in the Shobogenzo, one fascicle that is really wonderful, is called The Dignified Acts, or the Dignified Way of the Buddhas. And in that essay he wrote, and then I quoted this last week, that which imparts and possesses single fragments of the dignified behavior of Buddha is the whole of the cosmos and the earth, the whole of living and dying and going and coming. So that which imparts and possesses single fragments of the dignified behavior of Buddha, or of a Buddha, is the whole of the cosmos and the earth, and the whole of living and dying and going and coming. So as we discussed last week, these single fragments are those individual, or the individual acts that we engage in. It is the when and the how and with what spirit that we do things. And since I'm talking about Gassho, it's that spirit of Gassho. But it's also the spirit of how we drive our car, how we go to the bathroom, how we greet our neighbors, everything that we do and say. It's all of the individual actions of our life. So these single acts are the whole of the cosmos and the earth, the whole of living and dying and coming and going. So you can see why we put such emphasis on how we do things, how we deport ourselves, how we respond in accord with others' activities, and how this becomes the whole of the world, both ours and that of others. So that's how I started the talk last week, or last time I spoke about this. And the quote that we're using is from his text about, Dogen's text about how to eat oryoki, where he describes Gassho. He said, oh, wait, there's one more quote from the Dignified Behavior of a Buddha. So later on in this text, he wrote, when we realize the effort which is the energy of this real state of making things progress and throwing ourselves into the moment, then dignity covers the myriad dharmas. There is brightness in the monk's hall, the Buddha hall, the kitchen, and 3 gates. So again, when we realize the effort, which is the energy of this real state of making things progress. So when we realize how to do this in our own lives, and we throw ourselves into the moment in this way that is the Dharma, then this dignified behavior of a Buddha covers the myriad dharmas, all the dharmas that are arising simultaneously. And there is brightness. And brightness for Dogen, this komyo, is realization. And this brightness, it appears in the monk's hall, the Buddha hall, the kitchen, and 3 gates, which is to say, it appears everywhere in your daily life, every situation. All of the things that we encounter are an opportunity to engage in the activity of the dignified behavior of a Buddha. And what is that exactly? It is the time or the times when we respond to our life skillfully, with equanimity, with wisdom, that's grounded in letting go and letting our life meet us as we meet it. So letting things unfold and deeply listening before we respond. This is our life as it is right now, right in front of us. Since our lives are complicated with our feelings and karmic attachments, etc., it can be quite difficult. Agreeing upon some kind of form of discipline can help us to attain this state of mind. So that's what I want to continue to talk about today. The way I've been talking about this is from Dogen's talk, his essay called The Dharma for Taking Food, Fushuku Hanpo. So this is not part of the Shobogen, so it's a separate text that's in the Eihei Shingi, which is the rules for how to conduct oneself in the monastery. Okay, so in the first lecture, I talked about put your hands perfectly together. And particularly, we talked about what it meant to say perfectly. What does it mean to say perfect? So the quote continues. The next part of the quote is about how to do Gassho. There should be no space between the fingers and they should be fully extended. The tips of your fingers should align with the bottom of your nose. Make about a 1/5 space between your nose and thumb. So your hands are together like this, so there's a fist distance like that. Right, Gassho, if anybody doesn't remember, is this here. So it's like that. And then he said, this is the rule. So that's what I want to talk about. This is the rule. So we could question this comment, this is the rule. And we might ask, where is there space for our individuality in this? Are we supposed to all be like robots or something? They're all totally identical, doing exactly the same thing? And if I can't show my individuality, then how do I show my understanding and my sincerity without adding something extra to the activity? Without adding my individuality. Or on the other hand, we could just imitate other people. Maybe if I did my Gassho like the Dalai Lama, or like Suzuki Roshi, or like Thich Nhat Hanh. Maybe if I did my Gassho like anyone else other than my messed up self. Or on the other hand, we might say, I don't want to follow any rules. Isn't Zen about being free? Isn't Zen about doing whatever kind of comes to you, this spontaneous way of responding. So we could ask, what is the purpose of these guidelines, these strict guidelines on how to do Gassho, or any of the forms that we engage in the Zendo or during formal practice? So Suzuki Roshi, not surprisingly, said something about this. He said, our practice looks very rigid, very formal. But the reason why we observe such formal practice is to acquire absolute freedom. So he said, our practice looks very rigid, very formal. But the reasons why we observe such formal practice is to acquire absolute freedom. So that's kind of interesting. So I think that for many of us, if we take this word rule, and for Suzuki Roshi, this rigid, formal, if we look at that, those words, they're kind of like dirty words. So what is the dictionary definition of rules? I was kind of curious about this. So there are two main definitions. One is a set of explicit or understood regulations or principles governing conduct within a particular activity or sphere. And the second one is control of or domination over an area or people. So I think that we tend to think of the second definition as being the definition of the word rule, that somehow we're being dominated by this. We're being stultified. Our individuality is being curtailed. So we end up having a real attachment to our notion of the antithesis of this as being freedom. So it's in the context of this that I think Suzuki Roshi says, well, they look very formal and rigid, and so then we want to reject them. But in actuality, they are not. But this rigidity comes up, I think, when we're new to practice. Something feels foreign, weird. Maybe something else is going on in our mind, and we feel that we feel critical about ourselves, how we're doing things, or maybe about how other people. Maybe we're angry. Maybe we're trying to make a point in the way we do the forms. Or maybe we're being overly mindful. And so the result is, from the outside, it looks kind of rigid and formal. But really, that's not the reason that we engage in these forms. So it's what the reality is closer to the second definition, one of a set of explicit or understood regulations or principles governing conduct within a particular activity or sphere. But even that definition doesn't go far enough to talk about the heart of our practice. So I think the most important and interesting thing about what Suzuki Roshi said about this is why we observe such formal practice is to acquire absolute freedom. Why we observe such formal practice is to acquire absolute freedom. So I'd like to talk about what I think that means. So Suzuki Roshi said that the discipline of these forms leads to freedom. So what's freedom? In Buddhism, freedom is freedom from suffering. It is the freedom to move freely in our life with skillful intention and inclusive effort, which is the effort that includes the totality of our experience and people, situation, etc. So that means that freedom from a Buddhist context is not necessarily about doing anything you want. And we're in a culture that puts emphasis on individuality, self-expression, and consumerism as a gateway to happiness. You know, Burger King has that slogan, have it your way. And so that kind of epitomizes this mindset. But that isn't really how we get freed from suffering. So here's an example. Several years ago, I went on an elimination diet to figure out why I was having abdominal pain when I ate. And in this diet, I could start out with about 20 foods. And then I did that for like 10 days, and then you added like 1 food a day after that. So the point was to find out whether or not I had a food intolerance. Now, I couldn't find out about what was upsetting my digestive system without limiting what I was eating. So this is the part about rules. Without rules, I couldn't clarify my situation to enable me to pinpoint my suffering, to enable me to figure out what foods weren't working well for my body. So when I'm freed from eating foods that disrupt my digestive tract, I should be free from this kind of sickness that I had been experiencing. And then I would be really free, because that freedom would include the whole of my body's needs, not just my mind's idea about what I should eat to make myself happy. Like in our culture, maybe our mind's idea of what I should eat is I should eat ice cream and cookies and fudge and chocolate, and especially chocolate, right? And don't forget Burger King. So, we find out by following these rules that these foods don't sit well. So when I find that out, I find out what actually really makes me happy, what really frees me from suffering. So this is one reason that we engage in forms. When I went to Tassajara, there was a guy there who absolutely hated the forms. And it was his first practice period. When I was Tenzo, or head of the kitchen, he was on the serving crew. And the serving crew comes into the kitchen right before they take the food up to the Zendo. Now, the form or the rule for the servers is that, first of all, they're quiet. And the other thing is when they're not actively engaged in a task, they stand in shashu. So shashu is this here, where your hands are not up this high, but I'm not in the picture. It's further down. It's like kind of right around your belly button. Your arms are parallel to the floor. So that's shashu. That's kind of an at-ease position in Zen. So this guy clearly had a problem with the forms. So he wouldn't stand in shashu. He'd either drop his hands down or he'd do a really sloppy version of this. So he made it super clear that he didn't like doing shashu. And he was going to rebel against this. So for him, these forms, how he held his body, his deportment, clearly that was oppressive. He felt like it was impinging upon his self of sense, his sense of self and his independence. So whenever we find ourselves feeling this way, this is a really rich field of practice. This is a very rich field of discovery about ourselves. So we might ask ourselves, what is going on here? Why am I having this reaction? Because there's nothing about standing around in shashu in the kitchen at Tassajara that's going to harm us. That's one of the beauties of these forms. So why am I so resistant to doing them? So this rule boils down to, in our minds, it narrows down to the source of our suffering. So we feel we suffer because he was suffering because somebody was asking him to stand in shashu. So right at that moment, we can have some clarity about exactly what it is that's triggering our response. Now, the actual cause of our aversion to doing this might be hidden like the depths of a deep lake. But the aversion that we feel towards a specific form is like a spring bubbling up from the ground. And if we take time to drink from this stream, we learn something important about the source of our suffering. And when we can do that, we can begin to find relief and freedom from that suffering. So naming our suffering is important for making transformation, for transforming suffering into freedom. But we can't name that suffering unless we're willing to put ourselves in a kind of chute, in a narrow passageway of these forms. And then we begin to have some clarity about exactly what it is that's triggering this response. So this is one of the functions, if you will, of doing the forms. And the deeper function of that is to drop our attachment to having it our way. Now, Suzuki Roshi said that students should have a big field to kind of bang around in. But you know, implied in the notion of big field is that there's a fence around the field. So in the example I gave about the guy at Tassajara who didn't like to stand in Shashu, Tassajara was the big field. So that was what Tassajara was. So nobody gave him a hard time about not standing in Shashu. Just being at Tassajara in and of itself, there was that fence, that container of the monastic field. And then he was banging around, if you will, running around in that container saying, no, I will not stand in Shashu. So Tassajara itself and his teacher becomes the field in which he can explore his suffering. So after all, he put himself in that container. Nobody made him go to Tassajara, and he stayed in that container for 3 months. So somewhere in his heart and mind, he had his Buddha nature, if you will, understood that this container was transformative. And so he stayed in the container, even in the midst of, I won't. He did. So we need both the big field and we need the fence in order to discover and alleviate our suffering, to find this freedom, even though it doesn't feel that way sometimes. And that's why we're encouraged to stick with the practice and see what happens, to come and engage with formal practice and see what happens. So hopefully we realize after a while that the structure is helping, that this is a doorway, a dharma gate, to help alleviate our suffering. Then at this point, the forms become something more comfortable, and we begin to feel the sense of incorporation and cooperation with the forms. So what was at first resistance is now transforming itself into the dignified behavior of a Buddha. Now these rules become the freedom to move freely in your world in accordance with other sentient beings and non-sentient beings. You are like a child at play, but your play is not selfish. It is generous and inclusive. And Dogen said, that which imparts and possesses single fragments of the dignified behavior of Buddha is the whole of the cosmos and the earth, the whole of living and dying, going and coming. So this picture of Thich Nhat Hanh, if you can find it on Google Images, try to get it a little closer here. Look at his eyes. Look at his expression and his gassho. This is someone who is finding freedom and gone beyond freedom. This is the dignified behavior of a Buddha. This is the face of a man who looks at us with his hands in gassho and says, you can do this. You can do this. I see you, Buddha. I see that you are a dignified Buddha. You can do this. So how we place our body and mind in formal practice echoes and spreads into the rest of our lives. The stillness of Zazen, even in the midst of our busy mind, can be replicated, carried on, is present when we talk to others, even though we may not be aware of it. Something is triggered outside of formal practice through the activity of formal practice, which is for Dogen, in and of itself, the dignified behavior of a Buddha. So then we know that Gassho, Zazen, bowing, all of it is the whole of the cosmos and the earth. It becomes the whole of living and dying, going and coming. We don't have to force this anymore. All we have to do is stay put in our present life and fully attend to it. So in a lot of ways, our practice is about staying in the middle of the crucible of transformation. Sometimes it feels like you're in the middle of the fire. Sometimes it doesn't feel like you're in the middle of the fire, but that you stay in practice. Continue to do the practice. Just staying and doing what is asked of us is often enough. That in and of itself becomes the beginning and the middle and the continuation of our practice. There is no end to our practice. The beginning, the middle, and the continuation endlessly throughout time and space in these single fragments that we engage in moment after moment after moment. So in this case, talking about Gassho and the other forms that we engage in, they were developed hundreds of years ago as part of practice in order to affect personal transformation. But they also express something really beautiful about our life, about life in general. Again, this picture of Thich Nhat Hanh expresses something deeply, amazingly beautiful about not just his life, but our life. So please don't be discouraged because maybe you think the practice is only about doing things that you don't like or you think are really hard. So don't be discouraged by that, because in the fence of that is a really big field. So you may be sitting zazen thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow afternoon or later on that day. You may be sitting in zazen thinking to yourself, I would rather be anywhere else but here, but because I've got myself in this corral, I can't leave yet. But there you are, and transformation is happening. You don't need to be rigid about it. You don't need to beat yourself up. You don't need to sit in full lotus or half lotus. You can sit in a chair. If you're really having really difficult back problems, you can lay down. Dogen said in Fukan Zazengi, Zazen is not about sitting or lying down. And yet, that's all we see. I can't tell you how many people they say, well, if I don't sit in full lotus, blah, blah, blah. Well, not very many of us can sit in full lotus. And not very many of us actually can sit cross-legged as we get older. I have Dharma teacher friends who joke about having a throne around them because they're sitting on so many zafus and zabatons, propping up this, that, and the other thing. So really, it's about going into the field, going into the field. There's lots of space for you to bang around. There's lots of space for you to find out how this works. And yet simultaneously, you have to put yourself in the chute. If you don't have the rules, if you don't engage in the formal practice, then the spring that you can drink from is not there. You're just in the lake, floundering around. So as we progress in our practice, our suffering lessens. So what does that mean? It means that our response to our suffering is going to be suffused with a tempered patience and compassion for ourselves and others. Our Gassho and our life will become softer and more compassionate and filled with more humor and stability. So if you're having a rough time, again, please stick to it. If you don't come at all because of that, please consider entering the field. We're all here to welcome you. And finally, let us recall that Gassho, that all of these activities is a dignified activity of a Buddha, whether you believe it or not. There is a saying in Zen, they say, when you sit Zazen, you are Buddha. And we say, I'm Buddha just because I'm sitting here in Zazen posture, even though I'm thinking and doing this, that, and the other thing? Well, the news is, guys, is we're never not Buddha. That's the substratum of it all. What brought you to practice in the first place? Your Buddha nature brings you to practice. We're all the nature of Buddha. All of us, whether we call ourselves Buddhists or Christians or whatever, this altruistic desire to be in this community of our life, to love this community of our life, of all beings, being the world, making this world together. That's Buddha nature. That's what brings us to practice. That is the source of all of our altruism. So, you are always Buddha. You are always engaged in the dignified activity of a Buddha, and then, as Suzuki Roshi said, there is work to be done. So we do this work. And as we do this work, we learn that these are the gestures of generosity, inclusion, humility, and joy. Thank you.